Well, I think we'll get underway. If you haven't received a little handout at the door there, just raise your hand and we'll make sure that you get it. It's nice to be in Surrey tonight. Last time I was here was last fall. I drove up from Charlottetown with my wife and another couple to have a dinner, and beautiful setting. In November of last fall, and several of you have attended these meetings before, so it's sort of like a little bit of a broken record, and I just wanted to indicate that I was appointed, pursuant to the Public Inquiries Act by the Executive Council Cabinet, to look into the Lands Protection Act that was passed 30 years ago. And the Cabinet directed me to look into 4 specific areas, and those are, in the middle of the long sheet, 1, to determine the adequacy of existing aggregate land holding limits, given changes in agriculture, provincial land use and ownership trends, and rural communities. 2, options for reducing red tape and regulatory requirements while ensuring that the Act can be effectively administered and enforced. The legislative concerns that have arisen involving such issues as land holding limits as they apply to utilities, application thresholds as they apply to multiple owners, and the information deeming requirements for non-profit corporations. And 4, all other matters that I might deem appropriate to review and bring to the attention of Executive Council. And the power is quite extensive that I was given to the Public Inquiries Act. All of these empty chairs, we could have them filled here tonight. It's sort of like being short with the jury list. You just go out in the street and bring them in, ask them for documents and all that type of stuff. That's not my style, and I haven't seen the necessity yet of doing it, and hopefully that won't be the case. My style is more informal and relaxed. People like to make some presentation, love to hear from them, and then hopefully after that we'll have some comments and questions and informal. I haven't been asking to have the presentations presented in advance. The whole idea is to try as much as possible for me to learn from you. The Act was put in place in 1982, and good evening, in 1982, and at that time it didn't have a stated purpose, but in 1998 an amendment was made that did give us a purpose, and that's on page 2 of your little handout. And the purpose of this Act is to provide for the regulation of property rights in Prince Edward Island, especially the amount of land that may be held by a person or corporation. This Act has been enacted in the recognition that Prince Edward Island faces singular challenges with regard to property rights as a result of several circumstances, including A, historical difficulties with absentee landowners and the consequent problems faced by the inhabitants of Prince Edward Island in governing their own affairs, both public and private. In the province's small land area is B, and comparatively high population density unique among the provinces of Canada, and C, the fragile nature of the province's ecology, environment, and lands, and the resultant need for the exercise of prudent balance and steadfast stewardship to ensure the protection of the province's ecology, environment, and lands. And then there are a couple of little takeaways there that are about the maps there on the down below, and at the end there's a little bit of a narrative about the maps. It talks about non-resident ownership, and I don't know if that'll come up here tonight, but you folks living in the area, it's one of the most beautiful parts of Prince Edward Island. There's a significant amount of non-resident ownership here. It's one of the higher points, particularly on the North Shore. You can see it there on the property on the left. And then it also talks about corporate properties. And I made this point in Charlottetown the other day, and I make it tonight, is that there has been, over the years, a tendency to, as soon as you hear the word corporate, implies certain things. Well, there's lots of people are incorporated. I'm incorporated in the practice law. People have incorporation for 2 reasons. One, because of tax reasons, and the other of legal liability. And many farms in Prince Edward Island that would be designated as corporate on that map really consists of, when you break it down, farming members coming together in a corporate entity to farm. Okay? And when you look there, you see non-resident corporation, and those would be individuals in which the shareholders, the majority of shareholders, would no longer be resident of Prince Edward Island. And that took a significant turn downward a number of years ago when Henderson Lumber and Dundas Farms, that their properties were distributed and sold elsewhere and they were no longer there. But it's starting to change a little bit again. So there's lots of things we can and we'll talk about tonight. And I sort of think that I'll perhaps do something a little differently than I've done before. I've had the opportunity to go around and I meet almost everybody. And but I think this is my scribe here, Patrick Carroll. He hasn't had the benefit of that. And we've got some other people that are doing some work as well. And this is all recorded. And the media don't appear to be here this evening. This does go online, goes on disc and so forth. And it's a very relaxed setting. And so I think I'm going to do is ask people to tell me their names, and that way it'll help this chap a little bit when he's doing some subscribing here. And I know at least one of you wishes to make a little bit of a formal presentation. I think we're going to start after we do the introduction of names with Ray Keenan, who is a little bit of a brief and there's a little bit of a slideshow, and I think that'd be very helpful. And as I said at one of the other meetings, the topic really relates to the issues I read. Sometimes we get off topic a little bit, and as long as we're all respectful, everything will work out very well. And I know there are some individuals that want me to reconstruct the second set of 10 Commandments. That is not in my scope of jurisdiction. I'm here to learn. I was the person that decided there were going to be 14 meetings across the province. I wanted to go into areas that I thought needed to be gone into, and before it's all over, I suspect we'll have 15 or 16 meetings because there's a few makeups we have to make for snow and weather, and I think there'll probably be another one for Charlottetown because there are just too many people that want to speak. Okay, so Ray, we'll start with you. Ray Keenan. Yeah, you come on up there, and we'll, as you're doing that, we'll get your brother to start off by telling us his name, and then we'll just walk across there.
Alvin Keenan, in partnership with Ray and a company called Rollaway Holdings.
Okay.
Paul McCauley, farmer just east of Souris here.
Okay, and that's your son right behind you, and his
Chris.
Okay.
George Matheson. I have a sheep farm in Albion Cross.
When I saw you come in tonight, George, I says there's only one person that can be, but I haven't seen you in umpteen years. Not many people your height here that's not a Matheson, eh? Nice to have you. Okay. And then Mr. Roberts, your first...
Chad Robertson, farm with my brother and father. Marvin's Garden is our farm, Theta farm.
Okay, and you were telling me how many generations is it?
We're the sixth generation now.
Okay, and J.P. Arsenault, and Albert McDonald. We have already Mr. McCauley.
Blair McIsaac, farm in Bear River under Lily Pond Farms.
Okay, and then we have Patrick Keenan. And then we have Ryan Keenan. Okay, well, the Keenans are well represented tonight.
Thank you.
Nice to have you, Ray.
Thank you, Horace, and we appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I'd like to do is go through a bit of preamble here, and then I'd like to walk through some slides that I have. Some of them you may have seen. I do happen to chair the United Potato Growers of Canada, so I quite often am privy to quite a lot of information that may be of interest here tonight.
Could you take a moment and tell us a little bit about that organization?
What it does, it's composed of the membership of all of the provincial potato organizations across Canada. And I'm not here tonight on their behalf.
I know you're not,
but as an owner of land in PE and Souris area here. And one of the things that we do, of course, is with the membership is we try to collect data on how many potatoes are grown in Canada, what the size of the market is, and how many potatoes we actually need to grow in order to fulfill that market. We're not in the business of setting prices. We're not in supply management. We do like to manage supply. Part of that is that in the 4 eastern provinces of Canada that make up the bulk of the fresh potato business in Canada, being PEI, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario, we produce about 60. It takes about 65 million hundredweights of potatoes to supply the market in those 4 provinces. That includes processing. When we go over that, we get into an oversupply. And the problem with that, potatoes are very inelastic in the pricing structure. So if you were at a level playing field today and you're making money, and next year you raise the supply by 1%, you can expect a 7% decline in your price.
Okay, let's make sure we all get that. If you increase supply by 1%,
Yep.
and you're making money that year,
Mm-hmm.
then then it goes down by 7%.
I say every 1% increase in supply. Now, this is in North America. These numbers were compiled by Dr. Joe Gunther, who is a professor of economics at the University of Idaho, and he has spent his life teaching ag economics and trying to bring some stability to what the potato industry can handle. In the United States, they do not have the luxury of being able to know their market size in terms of to get the cooperation that we can in Canada. We have pretty good cooperation in Canada because of our provincial organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Prince Edward Island, we have probably the envy of the world in terms of data collection through our PEI Potato Board. For example, in PEI, we know at the end of every day how many potatoes are shipped. We know the price that they were shipped for. We know where they went. And that all is data that's very useful when you're trying to determine how many potatoes you need. That is not the same case in New Brunswick. That's one of the things that we are working on now through United of Canada is to, and the Potatoes New Brunswick people in the last 3 years have come milestones in terms of collecting data.
But right, and you know, any questions I ask, not from knowledge, it's just trying to get some knowledge. Mm-hmm. But so with the information being so good here, and for example, New Brunswick not being so good, the availability of our information, does that ever come back to hurt our industry here because others get our information but we don't get theirs?
To the contrary,
okay.
On that is in the United States, where they are doing it now through the United Potato Growers of America, they do a grower return index. And what that means, they have a group of economists have come together and they formulated a sample of all the potato packages, or some potato packages, to come up, and I'll take the Idaho Grower Return Index for a moment. And what that does, at the end of a week, when they complete their shipments, they have 5 right now. They have Idaho, Columbia Basin, Wisconsin, Colorado. And they'll put those 4 up on the board, and it will give the fresh weighted average of what growers returned this week on potatoes. And what that is, that's the cost of the potatoes packaged, what the average of those were for the week. Then when you deduct the packaging costs and the labor off the packaging, that converts back to a grower return index. That's what you as a grower would receive for your potatoes on a bulk form for what they before packaging and after. The interesting part of that is that the two areas in the United States this year that have had the most discipline with the marketplace being Wisconsin and Colorado. This past week, Wisconsin's price, for example, the fresh weighted average to a grower was around $6 a hundred. Conversely, it was around $3 a hundred in Idaho per hundredweight. The other Columbia Basin is very poor too, because Washington Washington and Idaho are leading the downcharge on potato supply this year on price.
Okay, I got you off topic.
So what we'll do, I'll just take you through a bit of a preamble here. First of all, Mr. Carver, it's no easy task that you have here to determine how many acres of land someone should own. I don't pretend to know myself, and however, we will take you through a few ideas that we have here and see if that sheds any light on it. We do appreciate the opportunity to express our views this evening. Like you know, we are large landholders in the community. It costs the provincial average this past year of growing an acre of potatoes in PEI is $2,800. That's to grow and put an acre of potatoes into storage. PEI this year had 89,000 acres. An economic impact study that was released just this time last year told us that the potato industry in PEI was worth $1 billion, billion. And that left about $245 million in household income. It also is responsible for 8,283 jobs, according to the report in this province. And it represents about 12.1% of the employment in the province. And on top of that, it is about 10.8% of the gross domestic product of this province. As growers, we have many challenges. We have increased operating expenses. We have an aging workforce. We have diminishing consumption of fresh and processed potatoes, and I'll talk a little more about that later. And regulatory costs that are totally out of control, including the Lands Protection Act, because it does cost a lot to administer this act, and for those that have to work with it. At the same time, we appreciate why the Act exists, because the consequences of not having control over our fragile land base is very sensitive to our environment. We all have opinions as to what ought to be in the case of landholding regulations. And I can tell you that as I started to compile a submission to this event, and I will be sending a more detailed one to you later, because as I get into it, I just found out how complex it is, and it's a daunting experience, as you know, and you know more about than I do.
I'm knowing even more than I knew before.
It is important that we're here tonight. We do realize that we have an issue. We're not living in denial of it. We're addressing it in a civil fashion. At the same time, I am concerned there's not a lot of people here. We don't have, this is a big issue. It affects everybody in our community, and we don't have very many people, so that is a concern. And why they're not here, that may, is it because maybe they don't care, or is it intimidation? It could be any number of things. So I think we have to be sensitive to that as we go through our discussions as well.
I just try to find out these meetings, Ray, are just trying to find out when people are present, what brings them here and get their comments. It's hard to speculate on why people haven't attended. We've had gambits of people all over the province. Some have been smaller like this, and others have been quite large. But I learned a long time ago from a guy who taught me a lot, Angus MacLean, that he said that quite often the best meetings were the small ones.
Well, maybe this is the meeting that'll set the pace tonight. Then.
Well, there you go.
As for recommendations to changes to the Act, as a small corporation that's committed to the community, we live here and we hope to stay here, and to that end, we are serious about our convictions. The comments that I'm going to make tonight, because are what we think we would like to see as far as our own operation is concerned.
So your comments are on behalf of you and Rolla Bay Holdings?
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is what we think we would need to see for the foreseeable future, so we won't be back here next year asking for the same thing, because we only like to do this every 30 years.
You'll be doing it with someone else next time.
We think the limit should be lifted to 5,500 acres per corporation, with the reduction of shareholders from 3 to 1. And the reason we say that is to help in the accommodation of succession planning. There's a lot of, I think the average age of farmers in PEI is around 55 or 58 years old. And there's going to be a lot of transitions of properties here in the next few years. Individuals who presently own land should be allowed to maintain their ownership and pass it down to their family members if so desired. And again, those amounts of acres vary, and I think they should be left with the people who own them. We have a lot of land that we rent from people that are glad to own it and are glad to rent it as long as they can have an income from it. And they're feeding the need for land for production. And quite frankly, we can rent land cheaper than we can buy it in this day and age. And that keeps our cost of production at bay.
So, Ray, I suppose it varies all over the place, but what would a fair rent that you'd have to pay for rental lands these days up around this area?
It would go in the area of $50 an acre for 1 year, or $150 for the 3 years with a 3-year rotation in that area.
Okay.
Would be a ballpark. For a third point, we think land owned by non-farmers should be made available to farmers for rent, providing the farmer is engaged in a certified farm plan. That's quite common now, that most farmers have a farm plan. That simply means that they're complying with the regulatory issues in respect to protecting their property and farming in a good manner. It is not reasonable to ignore the need for change in our province in respect to land legislation. Farms are forced to get larger to simply meet the needs of the economy of scale. Although there will always be a potato industry in this province, it will be different going forward, because it's taking less potatoes to do. Why do we need more land to grow less potatoes? Because we're going to have to go into crops that are going to be less profitable than potatoes, and they take land to do that. The economy of scale today, a large grain combine, for example, is not uncommon for it to cost $300,000 to $400,000. You have to have enough to do with that, enough work with it to make so your farm has to be large enough to warrant having such a device. Most farm tractors today are in the $250,000 to $300,000 range, so the size of the investment is too great to be too small. So we're going to, I'd like to do at this point, if I could, is walk you through a few slides. Would that be helpful?
Absolutely.
because we are going someplace, and I might just get up here if I can. This is a chart that was put out just to show of the maritime provinces how we compare in terms of cash dollar receipts and PEI in New Brunswick. As you can see, and we'll start in Canada. The PEI, at one time we were king of the castle over here back in the 80s. We were really doing well. And then along about the early 90s, something happened. It was called PVYN. And if you notice, that's about the time we started going downhill very quickly. And then shortly after that, of course, we had potato wart, which is another one that kept us out of the U.S. market. And then in 1995, this year right here, that's the year that the Maritime Region lost the westbound freight rate assistance program. And that's also the year that we lost the feed freight assistance program, and then the hog industry went south with it. At one time, it didn't matter where you raised hogs in Canada, because the cost of the feed was equalized through those payments, those freight rate assistances. Conversely, the same with getting potatoes to the Quebec and Ontario market. Now, after 1995, it cost real dollars to transport potatoes to Quebec and Ontario. That combined with the buy local situation, and StatCan figures released just a month ago showed us that potato consumption in Canada has gone down since 1999, 48%. So there's fewer people eating potatoes than there used to be. As we went forward here, the other provinces, New Brunswick is a bit more stable, doing a little better, and of course Nova Scotia is, or Canada, the rest of Canada is doing slightly better because of their proximity to the market. Here is PEI's. This is how well we're doing on the balance sheet. Here's our net income over expenses in PEI.
Ray, can you stand to one side as we can't see you? Yeah, there you go.
Compared to New Brunswick. And Quebec, of course, is always been doing better because of their market. They do have some the lower costs too. Energy, the electricity costs are less. They have some advantages. So that clearly gives you an indication of just where we are under the present set of circumstances that people are farming under. In the potato industry, we've got, first of all, declining domestic consumption in fresh, dehydrated, and the frozen category. And Dale Latham, who is the executive director of the Washington Potato Organization, was here last week and spoke. The only increase there is in market is for export to the Asian market. The domestic market in Canada and the United States is going flat to down. Increased yields are going up in the United States at the rate of 500 weight per year, each year. In other words, the United States is growing about 1 million acres of potatoes, and every year because there's new technology, there's new chemicals, there's GPS technology has made us better with our fertilizer, what we do, so we're getting better at it, so we're producing more, so we need less. There's an overcapacity of fresh pack suppliers in the U.S. There's more packing sheds right now in Idaho and in every jurisdiction, including here, than there is market to use the product. This is the decline since 1999. You can see where we were, and we've kept going straight down. And that has not As you can see, that line is on a steady decline. The decline in the frozen market today, you see where we're headed down in that. At one time back in the 90s, we needed a French fry plant the size of Cavendish Farms. We needed one every 5 years to keep up with the expansion, one in New Anna. That's clearly not the situation right now, because it's going the other way. With the exception of the red line, which is export going to Asia, and that seems to be being dealt with out of Washington State. That's the only place there's an expansion in the industry. And that's because of their proximity to for freight to the Asian market. Here's the decline in domestic dehy use. You see, that's gone straight down with a slight. It came up a little bit this past year. That's because of the shortage of potatoes in Europe, which caused that to go up again. But can it get back up to where it was in 2000? There's nobody that I've talked to that seems to think that it can. So there's no growth in that industry. That's the point. Here's your trend line yield again. It continues to go up. And here's what's really interesting. By 2017, planting the same U.S. and Canadian acres as we are today, that'll produce 32,500,000 hundredweight more in excess of today's projected demands. So what that means, if PDI today is producing around 27, 28 million hundredweights of potatoes, it would give all of PEI a surplus, more than would almost be the surplus of what we would have. So by 2017, we have to have 71,570 acres less than we have today if we want to maintain today's price. What happens is contracted potatoes are safe. They're fixed at a price. There's a cost of production involved with them. What's hard on this is when the open market is too cheap, and it makes it very difficult for processors to get the price up or keep the price up when there's so many potatoes being produced over and above that's going to drive the price down. The problem they have with that is when Dale Latham spoke here last week, he was asked, he took a group of farmers to meet McDonald's. And McDonald's sat down with a grower base from Idaho and Washington, and they wanted to know, when can we expect to get more money for our potatoes? And the McDonald's executive told them he would pay them more money for their potatoes when they stopped overproducing, because they're a publicly traded company and they cannot stand to pay. They got shareholders and they want to know how come they're paying so much for French fries, because there's all these potatoes we just said we're going to have, and we've already got 10 million hundredweight in Idaho, more than what the market can absorb this year. So there's a surplus of potatoes, so it's awful hard to get your price up on the fresh side and to hold it up on the processing side, because processors can say, well, why don't I just wait and buy them on the open market? Mm-hmm. Because you guys are clearly producing them for nothing. In an oversupply situation, if someone has a cost advantage, that generally that's what it does. It creates a steep destabilization and the pressure from buyers to lower today's price. And that in turn makes the pressure from buyers to lower future prices. It's not all bad news. There's some good things happening. we've got a hungry world that needs to be fed. Corn and wheat futures are high. There will be a reduction this year in potato acreage. We don't think it'll be enough to give us what we need, but this is certainly going to help. And it's probably the place that PEI fits in, because as we need less potatoes, we're going to have to use other crops if we want to continue to farm here, and they do have some advantages. Just as a matter of interest, that barley, strangely enough, is about 80% of wheat. So in other words, whenever you see wheat future, you can, if that wheat future price is good, you can generally expect barley to be about 80% of it. It doesn't matter if it's Canada or U.S. The U.S. produces about 1 million acres of potatoes. In Canada, we're about 500,000. But we share the same market, so we are one pile of potatoes. As you can see, the frozen sector is the biggest part of it. The shipping, the fresh part of it is going to continue. That line would suggest that I showed you earlier is going to continue to go down. The only chip industry is strong. It's got a little bit of growth in it, not a lot, but some. And the only one is fresh refrigerated potatoes, and they're not on this chart, but they're showing a little bit of gain, but they're so small. It's not a big gain at all. The good news is, this is a shot taken from the space shuttle at night. Here we are up in PEI, and we're where the lights are. And 65% of the population of the United States lives within a 500-mile radius of Philadelphia. The freight rate from Souris PEI to New York is about $5.50 to $6 per hundredweight by truck. The freight rate from Rexburg, Idaho to New York is conversely about $11.50 per hundredweight. We should be in the right place to produce food for this, because this is an affluent market. Their economy is starting to show a few signs of improvement, but they don't need all of our potatoes. And that's the dilemma we're in as a community if we think we can just grow more potatoes, because they will take the price down. I think we've got some certainly a lot of things being done here. It's not all bad news. We've got a lot of groups that are working hard on this to do something about the consumption of potatoes. One new thing there is going on right now, zebra chip. I don't know, Paul, you've certainly heard of it. It's a civet that's attacking the potato industry pretty well west of the Mississippi. And what it does, it causes the potatoes to cook dark, like make a black chip. It's called zebra chip. And it seems to be they found the civets in Manitoba, but it seems to be pretty much west of the Mississippi. The Red River flows into the Mississippi, so it's pretty well west of that. Dr. Gunther thinks that it may cause some production to come back to the east as compared to the west. Most of the expansion of the industry has been in the west. Of our major processors, we have 4. We have Simplot, Lamb Weston, McCain's, and of course Cavendish here. Cavendish are the smallest of the big 4. Interestingly enough, about land in 1968 or 9, Mr. Simplot when Alec Campbell was the Premier's PEI, he brought Mr. Simplot in here from Idaho because PEI wasn't very much in the processing industry then and wanted to build a plant. So one day I had never heard tell of him, and I was up at the warehouse where Russell Ching is here now, and I was there, and this guy walked in with a big cowboy hat, and it was Mr. Simplot. Don Anderson had him with him. He was taking him around on a little tour, and he asked, so anyway, he introduced him to me. I had heard of him, and obviously, and was quite impressed that he would be in a little place like PEI and in our place on top of that. So I asked him what he thought of PEI. He says it might be all right if he owned it all. And that's what some people still think, you have to own it all. We don't have a lot of options on other crops yet in PEI. The weather changes are helping us some. It is getting wetter and warmer, if anybody's noticed. In Washington, they have right now 8 other crops that are more profitable than potatoes. We don't have much history of crops that are more profitable than potatoes here in the East because they have been pretty good to us. It's where we are now. And again, all of the things I'm telling you are based on where we are now. They have nothing to do with the future. I mean, any of us can speculate. If Canada is successful in getting a free trade agreement with the EU, that might help us some. But I don't know because Belgium is a big producer of frozen products right now, frozen French fries. And the Belgians have, in Europe, they have the cheapest freight rates available in the world. They can go anywhere in the world for virtually nothing. And Dale Latham, the executive director of the Washington Potato Growers Association, he tells us that in the West here, the Western United States, they have abandoned the South American market because they can't compete with Europe. Because there's 500 million people in Europe that drink a glass of orange juice every morning, and those oranges have to come from South America, and they have ships hauling citrus to Western Europe, and those ships have to go back with something, and they're being laden with French fries that have a very cheap ride back. So for that reason, there's no growth in that Western hemisphere or Western part of the United States for potato products, with the exception of Asia. We don't have. It's highly unlikely that we can compete with. So far, we can't, because Washington can still grow more potatoes, and it makes it very difficult to compete with. There are groups like the PEI Agro Alliance, the Federation of Agriculture, the PEI Potato Board, the PEI Grain Elevators, the Canadian Potato Council, the United Potato Growers of Canada, and the United Potato Growers of America. The National Potato Council in the U.S., they're working very diligently trying to get the consumption of potatoes up. But French fries 2 years ago were taken out of the U.S. schools by Mrs. Obama. She feels that French fries are fattening. And there has been a group put together under the National Potato Board called APRI. It's being run under the direction of Dr. Maureen Story. She's a person that got everybody drinking Coke again. One time people used to think Coke was bad for you, and Coke hired her to get the consumption of Coke up again. And anyway, so she was commissioned to do the same thing with potatoes. The myth about potatoes are that potatoes are not as fattening as they once were believed to be, and French fries are not, because they're fried in vegetable oil. Most of the oil now is canola, and the trans fats are just not there. But yet the myth is that they are there, and that's one of the things that has to be turned around to get that consumption going back up. That's being worked on. Somehow we do have to find a way to make it work here in PEI. We have a small land base. We are a ways away from the market. We're not well known in some places. We seem to fit into niche markets pretty good. We have processors here that have the ability to go out in the world, but we're challenged by our costs of production and our economy of scale that is not serving us well in the potato industry. So, for that standpoint, I do think we have a future, but it's not going to be as we've known it. It's going to be a little bit different. And that pretty well concludes what I had to say. I don't know if you have any questions for me or anything else, but
Thank you very much, Ray. I'm not sure what you're able to do with your little machine, but can you go back a few slides?
Sure.
Are you able to do that? I'm looking for the slide that said, I think it's right there.
that one.
Okay. And I'm going to apologize in advance because it may be my lack of understanding, but if it is, you educate me. Do I sort of gather here that you're saying that down the road it's going to need fewer acres in order to produce the same amount of supply in the year 2017? Is that what that's saying?
Mm-hmm. It's going to take, in North America, it's going to take 71,000 fewer acres.
Correct.
So if we have 1.5 million acres in the two countries,
Yeah.
we're going to take 71,000 off by and that's provided consumption stays where it is right now, and consumption this year is at 91 million hundredweight on fresh potatoes and still sliding.
So it's always hard to predict the future, but it's possible that the 71,000 figure could in fact be higher if the consumption goes down, right?
Exactly.
And yet you think that the amount of the limits for land should be going up.
I think they have to go up for two reasons, because we have to bring our cost of production down, meaning we need to rotate land better, longer. We don't get much frost in the ground anymore to kill diseases because our forecasters are telling us it's warmer and wetter. We've got a lot of land in PEI today that's got wireworm in it, which is a small worm that's infecting potatoes. There's virtually no chemical to take it out. It means that those acres are going to have to be planted in something else. It is very challenging. And plus, the other crops that are going to replace potatoes are going to take more land to meet to give your production unit a balance sheet that you can live with.
Okay. People think that you just make this little thing in the spur of the moment, and I know you don't. It takes a long time in order to have the knowledge to put that all together, and thank you so much. I guess just one or two thoughts is the time that we had PVYN, it was just unbelievable how things changed so quickly. I'm the first generation in our family since 1783 that's not a farmer, but in a strange way, I was involved with PVYN because the law firm that I was associated with was very active in representing the farmers in New Brunswick on the matter, and how that there was a loss in court, and then eventually things improved and all that type of stuff. But I am interested in politics, even interested in American politics. And I couldn't believe how our misfortune could be that when that happened, one of the most powerful senators in the United States Senate, George Mitchell, had to come from the state of Maine. And if anybody thinks it's not important who you send to Parliament, and in the United States Congress, the Senate, we won't get into the Canadian situation, but
We don't have to be selective in our sentences.
apparently not. But I just couldn't believe, Ray, how it was a combination of probably the most powerful senator in the Senate at the time, came from the state of Maine. But what he was able to do, just like that, was absolutely amazing. Our border got shut almost instantly, didn't it?
And let me just talk about that a little bit, George. You've raised an interesting point. Relationships today with the U.S. potato community was never better.
Oh, good.
I can honestly say
Good.
that. That's not with Maine, but Maine is not the big players anymore. 1966 was the year that Idaho surpassed Maine in acreage, and today Idaho has 325,000 acres, Paul? Something like that, and Maine would have 56,000 acres. So you raise a valid point, and if we had back when PVYN and Wart were here, one thing we did do, and thank God we had the people with the conviction in our industry to get it done, but there were the safeguards put in place with CFIA and our U.S. counterparts, and we do meet with them. The Canadian Potato Council meets every second year with our American counterparts, and it's not a very fun meeting. It's not a place you'd want to go to have. They're not, just when you don't talk to somebody for 2 years, all your frustrations build up, and they have a representative that comes and clobbers you on the head, and we take our CFIA people with us to the same meeting. But I'll say this, those meetings are different now because there's growers in the room and we have more of a relationship. In Western Canada, Alberta and Saskatchewan are large seed producers to the U.S. industry, and they need their seed. So there's a better relationship than there ever was before, but it's because we do share a common market, and they come. Conversely enough, they ship as many potatoes north as we do south because all our chip plants in Canada have to have southern potatoes in the summertime.
Interesting. Well, thank you. And you're going to give us that, or are you going to send it to us relatively soon?
You can have that if you want. It's just on a.
All right, we'll take whatever we can get.
And I will send you. What I like to do.
Yeah.
Is send you more detailed one.
Absolutely.
And
we have cards here for the other dozen people that are in the room, and so forth. So, comments, you're not restricted, of course, to what Ray has said, but any comments that others would like to say, please. Sometime during the evening, I'm going to ask a few questions and so forth.
I thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you. Thank you. And when you were talking, we had someone come in and sit beside you, Alvin, and who do we have there?
And McPhee.
And McPhee. Okay. All right. All right. Now, comments, thoughts? You, George, we'd love to hear from you. Please come on over.
Well, I believe everybody in the room are friends, and we're neighbors, and I didn't take the time that Ray took, but I jotted a few things down to give you. It's definitely a different perspective. I better glasses. So we're little farmers, and happy to be little farmers. Gee, my bills are nearly all paid. Anyway, my wife and I, Melanie, are the owners of Springwater Farm. Ray helped us get the property there. We farm hay and raise sheep for meat. We own 324 acres. We are members of the Federation, and we believe that we are stewards of the land. We believe that the request for increasing land holdings that you're looking at is coming from the potato industry. Please say no. The potato industry has filled our streams and rivers with silt, killed our fish, poisoned the air, water, and soil. The island cannot sustain 100,000 acres of potatoes. Our suggestion would be a maximum of 75,000 or 80,000 acres in potatoes per year, with the potato growers on a quota system and a 4-year crop rotation. Ray mentioned that. This would be an improvement in our opinion. Their expenses would go down, and their bottom line would improve because of increased demand. My wife came up with this line: our land base as a province and island is small. Limiting the amount of land individuals and corporations can hold ensures that many have a chance to be part of this great province rather than just a few. Again, the answer to increasing the land protection limits is no.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Maybe I just ask you one or two little questions here. So, do you drive, both you and your wife, do you have other employment off besides the farm?
I do. I'm a part-time director for PI Mutual, and my wife is a full-time farmer.
Sometimes I think to myself, it would be so easy if you could just take a little magical wand and make things happen and go from point A to point B and everything like this. And I do think, just listening, that we are going in the right direction by having lower potato production. It's almost hard to believe that at one time, well, not too long ago, it's been 115,000 acres, and now we're down below 90, and in some ways that's not far off where you think it should be, which is another 10 to 12% away. I think the interesting part that I would love to hear you say, and maybe if you want to send me an outline and a subsequent letter how to do it, is how to get from there to an effective quota system of the distribution of 75 to 80,000 acres of potatoes, and have it work with a reasonable degree of harmony. And I want to create I don't want to create the expectation that you think that I could be capable of come up with that. But it's, and I'm not being critical. I'm just suggesting that sometimes it's awfully hard to take where you are to get someplace else if it is a significant change or reduction downwards, George. It's the only point I'm making in all of this. And you shouldn't take from my comment there or anything I asked Ray as an indication that you're able to figure out what I'm thinking. It seems to be a group tonight that we're all here together.
I'm afraid the quota wasn't an original idea, or it actually was a potato farmer who suggested it to me. He said we should be all growing 300 acres, and that's what you'd be allowed to grow. But I think the potato growers could self-govern. That would be the best answer.
You think that could happen?
Oh, yes. Sure.
Mark that down. Put his name and address, telephone number. I know how to find him anyway.
I'm not involved with the industry, so it wouldn't be my place to suggest it, Horace.
Sure. No, I'm just...
Self-government, they could do it.
All right, Ray?
No, just on George's point, what's interesting is what George's desire would be is not far off where, as you mentioned, George, where we need to go anyway if we follow. By the way, it was Jerry Wright that came up with these numbers on the supply. He's the CEO of United of America, but these numbers, there's no magic to these numbers. They're all taken from the U.S. Potato Board and trends, and they can be verified all the way back. But Harrison McCain, when he was living years ago, when they have a plant here, of course, and he said in his time that PEI was not capable of handling over 75,000 acres of potatoes environmentally. And it's kind of funny that there's two places, your comments, George, as to how many potatoes we should have, and that's consistent with what we probably have the right kind of land to put potatoes on. It's also consistent with the amount of potatoes, the amount of potatoes we need going forward. And the important thing is that less is more. You can have less acres, and you, instead of filling up our storages, we need to be filling up our bank accounts. And to do that, the price of potatoes has an awful lot to do with it. It is supply and demand, and we can't change. And on the supply management thing, Horace, just as a matter that as you know, supply management issues are under pressure right now with the EU trade talks going on, supply management and dairy, and that's going to be the most difficult thing for government to stay disciplined on, is to not give those.
Well, I hope they're disciplined on it.
But they did give away the wheat board, and it's something like abortion. There's 50% for, 50% against, type thing. And I think I can tell you this, that United of Canada, and United of America, we've chosen to try to educate by method of the numbers, let the numbers do the talking of what we need, because if we overproduce, we know the penalty. The penalty is great. And the supply management issues, as much as we'd all like to have quota systems like a milk quota, would be wonderful, but I think you'd have a tough time selling it in today's government. They're just not that kind of moody people that like that kind of atmosphere after going away from it. So,
you correct me if I'm wrong, but was one of the reasons why we were spiking up over 100 to 105, 110, 115 a number of years ago, because some people thought that the government was going to come in and put a maximum limit on what it was, and some people were trying to get their numbers up to be high in case they ever went to sort of like the fishermen did with so many traps. No?
Horace, I think it was driven because back in those days we had a 40%, they had a 60-cent dollar.
Okay.
And that's what brought the production here of French fries. Yeah. And it's also what's taking it away. Because as a Canadian dollar went up, we lost our clout.
We'll go back in one of the charts where you showed the graph of Canadian French fries and fresh, and there was a big gap a few years ago, and that's when our exchange rate was higher, and our production on French fries was coming from Canada, exported to the United States. And since that time, the one thing you didn't mention, there's so much information here, but the currency changes things, how we do it, and how our crops work.
Okay. Some other individuals like to make some comments.
I was taking off here, even though there's
A lot of talk on potatoes, and even if potatoes was to drop to 75,000 acres, how many farmers are going to be doing that in 10 years' time? Probably going to only 60% of what we have today. And just further reason why these limits that we have now are totally out of date. I mean, some farm units are spending enormous money just trying to juggle with accountants and lawyers to be in law, and something that's brought up earlier, like rotations are going to have to either get extended or, and in this area it's not too bad as it is, but I just think these existing limits are, for modern day farming, are just dead of whack.
Okay. Except for those, there are only a couple that want the act gone completely. Your request to go to 5,500, Ray, and reduce the shareholders down to 1 is almost at the upper limit of the request scale.
the 3,000 acre limit we presently have, and I don't know where that came. Probably at one time it was, in the beginning, had to be notional, if you like.
I think every so often I say to myself, I may go back and listen to some of my old speeches and Premier McLean's and others around 1981 and 82, but subject of being corrected by listening to the facts. My recollection is that they were put in order to achieve some consensus that was forming out there about those individuals that were dealing with processing, and also selected a benchmark that offended few, if any, non-processors in the area of farming at the time. Now, I may be wrong when I listen to some tapes, but I think that's my recollection of 30 years ago, how the numbers sort of came into existence.
Yeah, I don't think that there's been no shortage of potatoes because of the land limits. There may be, and I think only now it's come to pass that, we talked about, the Irvings and the McCains would grow the potatoes themselves. I don't know. I think there's people bigger than them now. The Chinese could buy all of Prince Edward Island tomorrow in one day if the land limits were off, because that's what they do now. They're going everywhere in the world to buy land. There's people. My point is, there's people bigger than the Irvings to buy land.
Sure.
And maybe even more money.
Yeah.
And more of a cause.
Sure. I could give you fact situations of people had many, many millions, or if you want to say $1 billion, and were prepared to be patient for anywhere between 6 months to 1 or 2 years. It would shock you the amount of land that could be acquired legally in this province without once going to IRAC or Executive Council. That is just the way the law has been framed over this period of time. It is in some ways amazing to me, a couple of things. One is that except for the court challenge in the late 80s about definition of leasing and leasing out, and then there was another instance in the early 90s that the first Premier Giz asked me to represent government, and we ended up in divestment of lands situation. Except for that first instance in the late 80s going to court, there have been no other instances that I'm aware of court. And I was asked 5 years ago to write an article on land in this province by a national lawyers magazine called Lawyers Weekly. And I elected at that time 5 years ago to write about the Lands Protection Act. And one of the common opinions of people from away, and I don't mean that disparagingly because, as you know, Ray and Alvin, my wife is from away, but is that there is this perception that if you are from away, you can't acquire lands here whatsoever. The reality is that's not true. That's just not factually correct. But what I have just said a moment ago is, never mind applying to Executive Council or IRAC, you give me enough money, and anywhere between 6 months to 18 months, it would shock you as a lawyer representing individuals from away who would come during a period of time to live here for 183 days, not consecutively, how much land we could acquire legally without going to IRAC and without going to Executive Council. And for me, it's one of my concerns that how do you do certain things to put a value on what is precious here in this province, about our society and our lifestyle, and those of you out there working the land, so forth. Yet preserve and protect the land and pass it on in a good manner to the next generation, and yet have it owned and controlled as much as possible by those individuals who are resident of this province, because residency does, in my assessment, attach to it a greater degree of interest and pride of place in this particular province and elsewhere. I know that the Keenans came from Woodstock and New Brunswick, but you've been here for 2 generations now. You weren't the only people that come from Woodstock, New Brunswick. Harry Fraser came from Woodstock, New Brunswick. I used to pick potatoes in barrels for Harry Fraser, and he was an avant-garde leader by having Fraser's newsletter and all of that type of stuff. And I guess what I'm sort of rambling about here a little bit is that this potential land grab that's out there in the world today, we haven't yet seen it here in Prince Edward Island. Give me that piece of paper I gave you. But the other day in the Globe and Mail, it was last Monday, the Globe and Mail business section, front page of the business section. I cut this out and gave it to Patrick. It's talking about New York. International billionaires are forking over tens of millions for New York's latest in ultra high-end living as a hedge against uncertainty, and many are doing it sight unseen. In this particular example, it indicates that in last year, 2012, that there were 2 condos near Central Park, New York, in which people paid $90 million each for these 2 contracts. And those people have billions. Okay? And if these individuals decide to come here, our landscape is going to go just like that, change. And anyway, it's just because there are some out there that think our Lands Protection Act is perfect, and there's others that want changes. And all I'm just saying about those who think it's perfect, I could write a nice little article and tell you how imperfect it is in regards to what I described earlier. Now, I'm not in any way, Ray, suggesting that the act is so perfect that it shouldn't be changed and so forth. The problem, in part, may be that there hasn't been enough conversation going on out there in which we are listening to each other, different points of view. And if there's one thing that I decided, like some of you know me, some of you don't, but those who do know I'm as independent as can be, and I was going to do it my way. I want to go into 14 plus communities in this province and have these types of conversations. And one of the things I wanted to achieve is for people who hold different points of view to be in the same room as other individuals with different points of view, to understand that we're all in this together. I don't own any land, and I own no shares in a company that owns land. But I would starve as a lawyer in Charlottetown if I only drew my clientele from the perimeters of Charlottetown. I'd starve, because 95+% of all my clientele is a rural Prince Edward Island. Anyway, you say, oh, well, this is all interesting. We went to hear tonight, and Horace Carver was talking about condos in New York and law practice in Charlottetown. But anyway.
I would have a comment.
Yes, Ann.
For you, and it's not about the larger land holdings.
Yes.
I work in real estate.
Yes, I know you do.
And
very good at it, too.
Thank you. I see you talk about land being owned by residents. I think one of our biggest shortages is residents. We need more people As you know, we're hemorrhaging our young people to the west of Canada, and we need people to come and move in. I just want to tell you a little short story about something that happened a couple of years ago. There was an older couple who lived here. They moved here from Ontario 20 years ago. They did a beautiful job with their property. It was 9 acres. It had some frontage on a river, which meant that 2 people were not enough to avoid going to Iraq, because it was, they said it was over the 330 feet. But anyway, they were fortunate enough to get a sale within, I think, 5 or 6 weeks. And this couple in Ontario had sold their house, their belongings were on a truck, and they were ready to move. But then the agent who was dealing with them said, well, yeah, but you've got to go through this other process. You've got to make this application for a non-resident purchase. Well, to make a long story short, the elderly couple who were selling the property wanted to move into Charlottetown to be closer to the hospital. And they were buying a house in there. So there was a whole domino effect. The people from Ontario who were moving here, the elderly couple who were selling, the next couple who were selling to the elderly couple. And when it went to Iraq, they said, well, it hasn't been on the market for 3 months, so therefore we can't address the application. So all of these people had their lives put on hold for that length of time, and and plus the $2,500 fee. So I think the couple who bought the property moved from Ontario. They had to go through the process when they bought it. So it's already been there. So in cases like that, I think it should be able to be purchased by someone moving into the province or anybody else without going back through the process again.
So we're dealing with 9 acres of land.
Yes.
Okay. Did you remember, and because I've dealt with you on a number of occasions, usually on the telephone, things like this, and you certainly know your business and do it very well. Do you remember the amount of frontage of water there, was it?
They said it was 600 feet on a river, but part of that 600 feet came down, and then it went into what was little more than a seasonal tributary.
Well, I wasn't involved in the case, and the regulations are now may not always be, because there's always possibility that I may make comment on them in the final report. But a couple of things just come quickly to mind. One is that, and I think one is that we have some very wonderful people coming to Prince Edward Island who desire to come here because this is a very special place. And when I represent them, I always get them to make their own writing submission to IRAC, because they will say it much more eloquently than any lawyer that they pay can say. Second thing is that one of the things that we are going to address in this is a clearer definition of what shore frontage is. And at the present time, it's not stated, but I can tell you when the Act was drafted, it was intended to be the coastline behind you folks over there along the map. It wasn't intended to be little streams. Yes, it probably would include a creek that would be off a tidal creek or something like that. But right now, if there's a stream going across a farm, that is regarded as being water shore frontage. Okay. What could have happened there if it was dealing with 9 acres and it was only 600 and odd feet, it would be possible for the couple buying from Ontario, if they could have had a couple of members of their family join the deed with them on it, and so they have a couple from Ontario and a couple of siblings or something like that, and it could all happen, and it would be happen without going through IRAC and all the whatever. That apparently is one of the things that I'm supposed to comment on what I just described. Some people think that that's abuse of the existing system, and that's included in number 3. And the second thing there, when it says in item 3, in the middle of the long sheet, it says application thresholds as they apply to multiple owners. So in some ways, and if the people from Ontario had been properly advised, there was a way to deal with that. Some would say that's a loophole. Others would say that that's the way the law is written, so therefore you arrange your fares according to the law. But I do think there needs to be some clarity on what water frontage is, and maybe we need to consider a little bit more the opinions of those that have decided to pick up their home and move here and wish to become a resident province. Maybe that needs to be given some consideration, one shape or form, such as that if you move here within 12 months of receiving approval, maybe, that may not even make my report, but I'm just in that mood tonight to say that maybe as an indication for your effort and consideration of moving here, maybe part of that application fee should be returned if you decide to move here and resident within a certain period of time. I don't know. One of the things that has happened not too long ago is we've had some what we call 3D flyovers of certain sections of Prince Edward Island. And some of it's quite interesting. We've all flown into Charlottetown and how beautiful it is when you see it. But anyway, I've been looking at a few of these 3D flyovers and came close to bringing one tonight, but I only got it so late in the afternoon that I didn't have an opportunity to review it with the person that produced it. And I just wanted to ask some questions about accuracy and things like this. But it really was, folks, taking this part of the province up along the coast and going along, and it was color-coded so that those fields along the coast that were owned by non-residents of Prince Edward Island were shaded in a light red, okay, and flying along the coast and the plain. An awful lot of non-resident light red soils along the coast up in this part of the province, a lot. And they were not just little cottage lots, there were large fields and volume of field, and I don't know what the right amount is of that, but I know that whole issue is an issue that, to my amazement, has received next to no attention in any of these public meetings so far.
A lot of the non-residents, a lot of the ones that are shaded in red, along the North Shore particularly, they're probably second, third, or more generations owned by people who moved to the Boston states.
Okay.
There are a lot of properties like that.
Okay. So that's a very fair comment.
I'd just like to ask Ann a question.
Sure.
Ann, are you finding any amount of U.S. or foreign or owned properties that are up for sale now as compared?
Yes.
Do you have a lot of U.S. properties that are for sale?
Yeah, when the economy went south there, a lot of them put their properties for sale. Yeah.
And is there local buyers to buy them, or are you seeing?
No, so local buyers. Many of our people in this region right now they can't come up with a down payment to buy a cheap house. So
My
local
point is,
buyers
land does come up for sale again sometime.
Mm-hmm.
We have, quite a lot of land in the Dundas area that was formerly Dundas Farms. Dundas Farms one time was about 18,000 acres in the early days. And anyway, a lot of it got sold off to different people. But I remember at the time, it was my father said, when Mr. Webster was the wealthiest man and one of the wealthiest men in Canada, he said, that land will never be for sale again. And because one of the richest people in Canada owned it. And then what's happened now, we see some of the richest people in the world interested in buying land here, and some of the land that's owned by the monks, I don't know where all the money comes from that, but there's speculation there's some wealthy people behind that as well. But the interesting thing is that land, minds do change about land. Mm-hmm. And that properties that we're seeing, because I know I have a brother-in-law in the real estate business too. He seems to get a lot of cottages on the west end of the island that are for sale, and more for sale than there is buyers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I see in the real estate business, I wouldn't say as much as Ann, localized, or perhaps even your brother-in-law, but is that there are some Americans that are disposing of it, particularly if there's never been any built on that property. So when mom and dad used to come up here and they'd go to a B&B or a hotel and they'd go out and enjoy their land, but then when they pass on, the family didn't want it. But there are a fair number of Americans that they pass it on unless they have to sell for economic reasons. They do pass it on down through the family if there's a built structure on it because it's become part of their lifestyle and so forth. The back row has been awful quiet here tonight. Okay. Now, Blair, I think you were at one of my meetings, weren't you, the other day? Yeah. Thank you for coming again, because you heard a lot of the stuff I said there. But do you have any thoughts on this whole matter?
I guess I just mainly wanted to come hear what was being said tonight. I thought it was it's a pretty important issue.
It certainly is.
I think over the years here, I think a lot of farms that were wanting to maybe keep expanding and stuff maybe have been limited to what they could do or where they could go to next. And another issue I see, that seems to be taking place more often is hearing of American farmers coming here and starting farms. Also farms from Europe.
Living here?
Apparently so, yeah. I guess I try to wonder why are they moving here and starting up, and some theories thinking is, well, maybe they're selling their own land and getting such a high value for it that they're coming here and basically starting up pretty easy. And I guess, when our own people got to points where on their own farms where they couldn't expand anymore, it seems to be something missing there.
But the farmer that comes from Europe or even the States, I'm not very familiar with that latter. I am with the Europe. But if someone comes from Europe, and even if they come with a bucket of money, they have the same restrictions on land as someone who has been here for generation. But they come and they're involved in the farming community. But we have some, like, how do the young people, you've got two young men on one side and another young fellow on the other side, how do they see how do you think they should look forward to farming in the future, Blair? No, I know, but do you have sons and daughters in farming?
Yeah, I have. Well, no, I have very young children actually.
Okay.
But I've been at it 20 plus years.
Well, you just have to work longer and harder.
Yeah. No, I guess I think it's still agriculture is a very positive industry to be into. But there seems to be places around the world that are. It was already talked about tonight, like it might be Wall Street bankers, are gathering together and going, okay, well, we need to spend some of our shareholder money tonight. Where are we going to buy land at? And they believe in putting it into agriculture, whether it's here or whether it might be in Quebec or it might be somewhere else across Canada too. I think, like I was just a teenager, I guess, when this law was originally first done up, so I didn't have any real say in it then, but I've seen as we farmed over the years where, it was certainly something that could hold you back. Yeah. I think too, just one other final point, is the main reason I think this has been put forward to get this going is this is a farmer initiative, correct?
Well, let me put it this way. That simple question is sort of subject to debate as well. It appears as if it was an initiative that came forth as a resolution from the Federation of Agriculture, and the government decided to do something upon it, whether they were acting solely in response to the resolution or whether they were taking the position that's 30 years in place. There have been various comments that need to happen, and there have been various amendments that have been made over a period of time, but there has been now, it's been 20 plus years before there's been any sort of in-depth review. Without taking away from the Federation of Agriculture, I'm not sure that they can take all the credit for this happening. I have a feeling that government has heard from various people and said 30 years, it's a whole generation. Let's ask somebody to go do a review. There was an ad in the paper last September. I saw the ad. I filled out an application and wrote a covering letter, put a resume in, and my wife and I went away on holiday, and I came back and I found out I'd been selected. That's how it happened. And there have been lots of changes have happened to the Act over the years. When it first happened, this was a statute in which it was pretty easy for farming corporations. Basically, a farming corporation didn't have to apply to IRAC and didn't have to apply to Executive Council to buy land. All they had to do was say they were a farming corporation, that was it. As long as you're within the limits, that was it. But over time, those things have changed greatly, and there's been much more paper and regulations and reporting and things like that. It's also, I don't know how many of you know in this room, but like, for example, I'll find out. The farmers in the room, how many of you have farming corporations? Okay, I guess the only ones that don't are the Macaulays. And in any event, when you take your land that has been in your name for some time, or you go buy land and you put it in a corporation, because it's over 5 acres in total that you already have, and you get into the calculation of share, you have to apply to IRAC. And it's guaranteed, absolutely positively guaranteed, that IRAC are going to put some conditions on it, even if it's been in the Keenan or the Robinson family for a long time. And one of the things they're going to put on is either no subdivision, or there's going to be identification for non-development except agricultural purposes. Now, non-development does include the right to have a home constructed, so it's there. Okay. And then later on, you want to sell off a lot to a member of the family or to build a house or anything else, and you find out it has been identified. Well, it's a reasonably complicated and expensive process to go through to make that happen. You can do it yourself, but quite frankly, what people do is they go to a lawyer and ask them how to do it and make it all happen, okay? What most people don't know is that when you got the approval for your corporation to acquire the property in the first place, that if you had given notice at that time, in 11 years' time, the identification would have evaporated, just gone, okay? And why do people not do that? Well, 99% of the 100 people don't know it. They're too busy and they don't get done, okay? And you have a number of properties in this province that were identified more than 10 or 11 years ago that are still identified. The question can be raised whether they should still be identified. Maybe what the different way of doing it would be is that you make the identification for a 10 or 11-year period or 15 period, whatever the case may be at the time, and after that it's just gone. It has evaporated. One thing that has appealed to me a little bit as something logical, it happens to be my idea, so I guess I think it's logical, but anyway, is that when you apply to IRAC to get the approval for a company to own land or for non-resident to own land, And you know at that point in time that within a year or a year and a half, you want to have another member of your family take off an acre to build a house. To me, it ought to be possible that IRAC can give its approval for the transfer to take place and put a little note on it saying that within the next 2 years, the property owner is able to have a lot surveyed up to an acre or an acre and a half without having de-identification and without going through publication newspaper and without coming back to IRAC and without going to executive council and without going to a lawyer again. To me, that is just so logical and reasonable. It is so logical and reasonable that we might even see it in some writings in the next number of months. Okay. Mr. McDonald, nice to see you. I usually see you on television. But we don't have any TV cameras here, but we're glad to have you. Thanks for coming, John. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that some of this stuff has got built up, maybe for good reasons, but at some point in time we need to look at the good reasons and see if there's still good reasons. Okay. Chris, Patrick, Ryan, and Chad, you guys are the next generation. What are you going to tell me tonight?
Go ahead, guys.
I guess you do have to look at those limits, along with the changes that have happened in farming in the last 30 years. We've taken land out of production, we've put in grassed waterways, grassed headlands. I think the farming community has done quite a bit for the environment. And we're all watching our land now. So when it comes down to if we're restricted to what we can do, yeah, those land limits might have to come up a bit.
Okay. Chad?
I like the idea of the Lands Protection Act. I guess the cap that's on it, I don't think Ray's too far off in asking for a 5,000 acre or 5,500 acre cap, but it's not working the way it is now anyways. I mean, the large farms, as Paul mentioned, you know, you get your lawyers and accountants and get your company structured in such a way that you can get by with what you have, or just disregard them altogether and pay the fine if you want. So it's not working the way it is. Something has to change, but I like the idea of having a cap. I'd be scared to see what it looked like with no cap. And I'm also worried about, I guess, I'm not anti-immigration by any means, but I'm worried about the foreign investors coming into the area. They can have deeper pockets than us humble farmers in a lot of ways. That I'm on a farm where we're constantly trying to expand. Just, I guess it came from a very small farm, and Dad was there kind of by himself for a lot of years, and now my brother and I are there with him, and it takes a lot to go around, and you know, your profit margins are pretty small on the farm these days, so you need a lot of acres to keep the thing going.
Do you and your brother have off-farm jobs?
I have a sand truck with the government, which really doesn't add too much. It's just a little bit extra income in the winter, but makes the tax man more than I make usually. But no,
Chad, from another life, I understand how little sand truck out there.
Yeah.
Do your spouses work out there? I'm not trying to be nosy.
Yeah, no, yeah, both their spouses work for the provincial government in the healthcare as well, so it's certainly a help. But I guess that's all I'm saying, is it's hard to compete with the, I guess as was mentioned, the foreign investors.
When you said it's hard to get things go around, I take that you're talking economically, but are you also saying that it's hard to acquire a little bit extra land that you need for your base?
Yeah, especially I guess where we're up in the Far East.
And what's your community?
We keep getting smaller and smaller as we get to the point. So yeah. We're in, I guess, the Kingsborough, South Lake area.
Okay, so you Your last name is Robertson?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we'll come back. We haven't forgot you guys over there in the corner. We just expecting extra thoughts from you now. Okay? But how many of you have applied for this environmentally sensitive exemption that's available, that you can get up to 40% of your land if it's wetlands, forests, or steep lands, or all that type of stuff? Have any of you applied for that? I think the Keenans have. Besides the Keenans, have others applied? Blair, have you applied for yours? Macaulay's? No. The Robinsons haven't. Okay. All right. A couple of years ago, government passed a regulation and basically said that if you had environmentally sensitive lands like hedgerows or wetlands or very steep, thank you, Patrick, very steep lands, that you could apply, or land that you need to keep to prevent soil erosion, or grasslands or hedgerows or things like that, you could apply to the government. And you could, if you had 1,000 acres now, then you'd have to go through IRAC and you go through the Department of Agriculture and Environment, and someone will come out and check and make sure that you truly had steep lands or wetlands or whatever, that for 1,000 acres you could get up to 400 acres, and if you had 3,000 acres you could get up to 1,200 acres. So that had a way of expanding your limits. But when I spoke to the Federation of Agriculture, I asked how many farmers had lands that qualified, and they said, I asked for hands, about 35 or 40, but there were only about half a dozen that actually applied. And the Minister of Finance was there, and I told him that the purpose of the regulation might have been noble, but that if farmers weren't taking advantage of that, that he effectively had a regulation that wasn't working. And
a lot of the uptake of that was very concerning to people. They're afraid that once that happened, then they would lose control of the land entirely. Just, I don't know, for fear factor or what have you, that was one of the very common comments.
And I think, that's one part, and I think another part was that they didn't want the civil servants coming, the Department of Environment coming on the property and all that type of stuff. And I think there's a solution to both of those comments, Alvin, and the solution is about fear of losing the land, is that I don't think that is really justified, because they still own it, and it's not being under a Natural Conservation Act. I'm not sure that's the right word, but Albert, what's the right word? Like the Island Nature Trust Act. What's
the exemption for the natural areas protection?
Yeah,
It's natural areas.
yeah. So it wouldn't be designated under that, which does effectively amount to losing control. And I made the suggestion in Morel, which seemed to be a little bit of a hit, that maybe instead of having civil servants come out and do examination of the land, that we could have retired farmers come and just look and see what they thought of it. And there's no one knows better than another farmer as to whether this is a land that should be exempt or not. And the quick retort from someone in the audience who was trying to get his brother to retire from farming, thought that was an excellent way for his brother to have a part-time job afterwards. Anyway. Okay, now guys, you're back there and you're smiling and you got all the answers. What are you going to tell me? You've listened to your father and uncle here tonight.
Same as what Paul was mentioned earlier. We go to grower meetings, and we hear the age of the. I don't know what the average age of the potato farmers are on the island, or any farmers, but it's on the higher end than the lower end. So we see other farmers joining together and combining just to keep going, which means they got to do, not necessarily always bigger and better, but they got to be doing better. And sometimes it takes more land, and we shouldn't be held back if there is an opportunity in the future where we do demand more acres for production. and be left behind. And as far as the exemptions, that includes the woodlands and stuff as well.
Yes.
So with the climate changes and stuff we were experiencing the last few years, that we don't want to be in marginal land anyways. Wet disease, it just seems to be a waste of everything.
So what do you mean, Ryan?
Well,
what do you mean to that last comment?
we don't seem to benefit at all by going into marginal land anymore. It's not worth planting, not worth harvesting. It's
maybe we each misunderstand each other. Like if you had 1,000 acres of land and you had some wetland and marshland and some swamp and some woodland, things like that.
But there's some gray areas in between that if you could keep your more efficient land in production.
Yes.
And just keep that in production. And if there's opportunities to expand, I don't know if you want to define it as wetland or not, but if there's possibilities to take poorer land out of production and get those offholdings in the future, maybe, I don't know, but that'd be one part. And the other is the part on woodlands and stuff that we need to keep exemptions like that in place so that the island isn't completely cut down.
Well, if you did cut down, it's my understanding that you probably lose that particular exemption. I think I'm right on that. Okay, Patrick, you let your cousin there say some things.
Well, I'm 100% agreement with Ryan on that. And I agree with Ray and I agree with George. It's all relevant. With Ray, with the markets, the industry, the way the industry is going right now, we do need to cut down on our potato acres to make a profit. Or we're just not going to be here to buy any land anyway. With George, was he saying, he's right on too, and we are becoming better stewards of our land. We don't want to spray any more than anyone else wants us to spray or over-fertilize. It just shouldn't happen anymore. It just costs too much, and to get more acres, I think we should do that, to bring different crops, cash crops, more variety, to just fill in a void of anything to come, basically.
Now, we got almost two age groups here. The other week I met the young farmers. They meet monthly, and there are only 10 or 12 of them, but I was there for an hour, quarter hour and a half. I was really impressed. We had people who left their family in Europe and come over here themselves. They're here and living, a young couple from Ontario that moved here, and some family people who have generational stuff and so forth. But I am impressed with their comments, just like I am with the young people, younger men tonight, and so forth. But we've sort of alluded to it, and yet we haven't. And then we've got another age bracket here tonight. Ray and I were talking a little bit about that earlier, before the meeting started, how we deal with succession. Like Blair said, he doesn't remember this. He was only a teenager when this happened 30 years ago. But just think what your age is today and take 30 years off of it. So, when you were 32, a lot of stuff didn't seem very important in one sense. Not saying this act isn't important, but I'm just saying you didn't think about what was going to happen when your dad passed on and so forth. But now, when you got people in their 60s and late 60s and early 70s, and immaterial of what it is that I decide to say, and I'm just sorry, Patrick, that whatever I decide to recommend, there's no guarantee the government is going to follow it, but the report will be written reasonably clearly so that hopefully government will see fit to pay attention to what I've said, is that, do we need some extra discretion? Do we need some, and never mind the limits, I'm not into that right now, but do we need those people that administer the act, do they need some discretion and ability to say, okay, well, the estates are more complicated than they used to be, you know? Sure, a few estates can be wrapped up in a number of months, and the old rule used to be it should be done in a year, but some of these farmers' estates, and it's pretty much more complicated. It takes years, and then you deal with not just death, you deal with people who have dementia and who have other health problems and so forth. I mean, these are reasonably serious concerns, and there needs to be, I would suggest, some consideration to give to discretion. Anyway, does anybody want to comment on that type of stuff? Alvin, you look as if you're ready to say something. Okay, thanks for coming. Thank you very much.
I have a lot of thoughts that are, sometimes I think they're relevant, more times I think they...
Well, if you've got a lot of thoughts and you've got a lot of paper, why don't you come up to the table?
Well, but I'll come up here because of the mic and so you can record it. But because of my position in agriculture and on the Federation of Agriculture, I've had some consultation with growers, different farmers from different sectors. And I want to make it very clear, I am not speaking for the Federation of Agriculture. It's Alvin Keenan with thoughts that he has, and any differences from the Federation of Agriculture that will come from the Federation, you know, once we have more consultation with the board.
And we will hear from them in the next number of weeks or so, right?
I truly expect so.
Thank you.
When we talk about rotation on our farm, and in respect to everybody's thoughts, there isn't anybody that's wrong when we have environmental issues from siltation that, you know, damages our waterways and things like that. And I think it's fair to, and I always want to be fair, and I think it's extremely fair to say that whether you're a large landholder or control small acreages, being a good steward of the land doesn't come or go with any of those examples. I think that's very fair. And I never did think that we would see, you know, I guess it's only because I hadn't experienced it, but when we talked about potato acreages here a while ago in production, like 3,000 or 4,000 acres of potatoes extra in Prince Edward Island over the market blows our economics to pieces, and we have huge losses. So when I saw, for example, soybean production coming to Prince Edward Island, and it went from 5,000 acres to 50,000 or 45,000 in a couple of years, I was holding my breath and my heart was thumping. My soul, do the growers not know what they're doing? That'll destroy the value of that commodity, and they'll have economic disaster. But then I became to realize it's different commodities, different world markets, and what extra acreage was grown on Prince Edward Island was so trivial to the world market of soybeans, it didn't register. And growers have made good returns on that. So now we see, and that's what I use the word sectors, these commodities, these different commodities compete with potatoes in rotation. So I can see very conceivably that what's good for Prince Edward Island may mean that different sectors, like your wild blueberry operations, your one man, if I use the word man for a moment, but one person ownership in a soybean production, they may need to own or control, maybe not necessarily own, but control and rent and trade 2,000 or 3,000 acres of land to be competitive. So I can't imagine in my life how we're going to have these sectors if they can't play the game. Now, I know if there's a bump on the road, we soon learn how to get around it. And that's some of the issues that in legislation, if things like this are deemed to be sensible, can they be made possible so agriculture can be strong on Prince Edward Island, and we can generate the dollars that we have to keep our rural areas alive, and for health care and education for our for the generations to come and what have you. I see this ever more changing faster than I ever expected before. And so that's some of the comment that I wish to make tonight, and I feel very strongly that it's not at all derogatory to whether you think you should be able to have 5,500 acres or not change the limits at all. But I think somehow we have to, in our legislation, we have to allow agriculture to thrive in Prince Edward Island and our economy to be strong and our environment to be healthy. When you look back at the purpose, and I never wanted to be a lawyer, but I look back at the purpose of your act, and I'll say, I guess it's probably page 2, but to me, you can read anything you wish into this, but the purpose of the act is to provide for the regulations of property rights of Prince Edward Island, and when we're talking about, and especially the amount of land that be held by a person or a corporation, so we're talking about that. And one size fits all when you talk about all, meaning different sectors, different types of crops. I don't think one size can fit all anymore. And for the last 30 years, it hasn't been challenged, and we're thankful that it hasn't. And we know it very well could have been, but it hasn't come to that point. And I very much agree with you that the resolution that was passed at the Federation of Agriculture a little over a year ago just happened to be at the time when this thing had to be discussed anyway. It was coming. And that's because you had frustration and all the different pieces of land transaction that had to be dealt with by Executive Council. That would mean that IRAC couldn't deal with it, so something's not in compliance or Executive Council wouldn't have been necessary. I'm assuming that's somewhat of it. Historical difficulties with absentee landlords, we have our history, and it may come to that again someday, and if it does, they'll have to deal with it. We know a province is a small land area, comparatively high population density, unique among provinces of Canada. That's all accurate. So we have and then, the one that's important, the most important to me, the exercise of prudent, balanced, and steadfast stewardship to ensure the protection of the province's ecology, environment, and lands. And so we're saying everything here that needs to be done. And somehow I think that's the formula that we need to follow. And as I sat in Charlottetown a few nights ago and listened to people that were not directly involved in agriculture, and their comments were the best that they understood. But as we sit out in the areas where we are, and we're all different here tonight. We all have different involvements in agriculture. I mean, some have experiences in marketing of fresh potatoes. Some more have experiences in marketing, like processing potatoes, experience in studying contracts with the processors. And I find that they're all experts in their fields. But this affects Prince Edward Island as a whole, and the legislation that is written in the near future here needs to be so agriculture can grow in Prince Edward Island. If we bring soybeans into our production, for example, there's not a thing wrong with that. There may be agronomy issues with different crops following certain crops, but that's a different topic. But if we add one more crop to our 3-year rotation, and really it's the Crop Rotation Act, it doesn't increase our potato acreage any. It just adds another crop. So it's a long study. And Ryan mentioned, and I'm not sure if you understood exactly what he was saying, but I mean, we have lands that we shouldn't plant, we have wetlands, and we have slopes, but we have some gray areas. And what he meant is some marginal land that doesn't yield as much as some of our better land. So in that case, should that land be not necessarily cropped in potatoes, but I'm amazed at how they get some of this land harvested with the combines today in soybeans. It just makes me shiver when I drive down the road in November and see fields covered with soybeans where I couldn't get close to it with a potato harvester. And by gosh, the next day you can buy and they've got it harvested. And I think, how in the devil did that happen? But it's different because they're not tilling the land. and they're not disturbing it. And then we're having problems with insects, and there isn't the chemistry available today to control wireworm and what have you. And we go to the sessions, and you have your doctors in agriculture will tell us we need to till the land more with different crops. It doesn't allow certain insects to thrive in it and cause the pest that, like wireworm is one of the examples. But so with some of these other crop rotations, which we need larger acreages in operations to facilitate that, we can combat some of the environmental issues that we're having today. Where instead of us having to use pesticide, we can rotate with different crops and have a stronger environment. So those are all things in the future that I don't know the answers to all this, but this is all very factual and very close in hand. But we have to be able to play the game. And I think we should be accountable for being good stewards. And I do think we have the mechanisms to monitor that.
So Alvin, in regards to being able to play the game and to be good stewards, what do we do about those individuals that aren't good stewards, don't want to play the game when it comes to stewardship and crop rotation? Do those individuals, should they receive the same entitlement and benefit of land ownership laws?
I don't know how you decide what you don't allow somebody to do if they don't comply with the regulation. I think the regulations themselves, the regulatory body has to deal with that. Whether somebody, if they cause a fish kill, does that mean that they can't increase their acreage limits? I don't think the two are related. I think if you cause that, you have to put the safeguards and the due diligence in place, so that's less likely to happen again.
Well, you've been in enough of my meetings. You're one of my most faithful attendees. That in the Montague meeting, we got into crop rotation, not between you and me, but it was raised, and so I asked someone to elaborate a little bit on crop rotation, and John Jameson, who's the executive director of the Federation of Agriculture, said it was his assessment that 75% of all farmers were honoring crop rotation. And you've heard me say that sounds pretty good. If you got 75 in the test, you feel pretty good, but the more you think about it, 25% of farmers not honoring proper crop rotation doesn't seem exactly outstanding. Absolutely.
Maybe Ryan, you or Chris could speak to it better than I could, but you touched on something a few minutes ago about stewardship. The governments are broke. Governments don't do a very good job at policing things because they're awkward at it. One thing that happened in the Souris area here is the Souris Souris River Watershed group that I put together. And that's where a group of you guys came together and talked about how you could prevent erosion in these streams. And I stand to be corrected, but have we had a fish kill in this area?
Well, let's answer the question.
Let's answer what local people did.
Sure. Let's answer the question that we talked about in Montague, though. And to me, the question revolved around if I could buy more acres, I wouldn't have to farm my land so tight. But so this person, maybe would have been interested in more contract, but as the chart showed here tonight on the board, there isn't more potato sales in North America. You just have to take that production from somebody else. So there isn't any new business. You may be able to acquire more yourself, but I think that that's easier comes when somebody wants to sell some land, and you have to be allowed to have the acreage limit so you can farm the land that somebody else doesn't wish to farm anymore. But that's why I said being a large farmer or a small one doesn't necessarily mean you're a good steward. And the 70 or 75% that are not in compliance, they should be made come.
The 25%.
Sorry, the 70. Yeah, the 70% that are in compliance, or the 30% that aren't, or 25. Whatever the number is, they should be held accountable for that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Alvin. Mr. McDonald, you came in a little afterwards before we all introduced ourselves, and would you like to make some comments?
Well, I just don't know what to say about this issue. I know, a lot of land has grown up since 1935, and it's either poor governments at the helm, like during World War I, a lot of land was cultivated. It was a very prosperous place, and then after World War I was over, the boys come back here, but they didn't want to farm. And I don't know if they even came back here. And then the place just simply grew up, and I don't think that's very fair to the province of Prince Edward Island. As you could see in the 1935 map, there was a lot of land that was clear, and it has grown up, and we've tackled clearing it again, and it's not easy. It's very expensive. Our forefathers had to be very good people to clear the land and have it into good production. It was about the 1830s. A guy that's related to the he was premier and went on to be an MP in Ottawa. I just can't think of his name, but he started exporting potatoes at that time, and there seemed to be very good demand for a lot of our produce, as well as potatoes. And you would think that we'd be number one, but Idaho and Washington State and other places all seem to surpass us, and surpass us on a big scale, and then we have to play second or third fiddle. And I don't really know what the answers are, and I would just hope that our boys here will have a place and be able to make a living, as we're soon going to pass on.
Well, I hope you're not too good a prophet. Hope we're able to stay around for a little bit. Okay, thank you very much. I know you've been an early leader in the blueberry industry for some time. I'd just like to ask one or two questions, then we'll call it quits, if that's all right. I'll stay around as long as afterwards you wish. There's some cards here. If you get some other thoughts you'd like to send me, email or letter, it'd be wonderful. At the present time, the law is different than it was when it started. In other words, if Alvin Keenan leases in 100 acres of land, he has to count it. But if he leases out 100 acres of land to Mr. McDonald, it used to be he never had to count it, but since the mid-90s, he now has to count it. In other words, we have 100 acres of land, and Alvin Keenan has to count it because he leases it in, and a different 100 acres of land he leases out to Mr. McDonald, and he still has to count it. So what do you think? It's called double counting. Okay. So what do you think about that? It's basically the person who owns the land counts in his inventory. The person he leases to has to count it, but we're still dealing with the same land. Okay. And how many of you folks lease, Paul, do you lease out much land or lease in much land?
Lease in quite a bit. But
You lease in quite a bit, and do you lease out very much?
no.
Okay. All right. If the situation was such that leasing in, because when you lease something in, control goes with it, and if the lease out is properly done, the idea should be that control goes with it as well. Okay. What would your comment on that be? In other words, that if it went back pre-1995 or 1996, what would your thoughts on that be? So if you lease in, it counts, and if you lease out, you're able to deduct it. Alvin?
I think that's the way it should be.
And if it was that way, would that be something that would be generally welcomed in the agriculture community of this province?
Well, all I know is in our own case, that would affect the amount of acreage that you would have to own to be in compliance. Have to be allowed to own to be in compliance.
Okay. Now, I know you told earlier you never want to become a lawyer, but that sounds like a little bit like a lawyer's answer. So,
but
He gets that hanging around him.
no, but it is simple, and you either divulge what you're doing or you do not.
yeah, okay. And what I'm trying to get at, and I'm very, I don't know what the right word is. The idea was the law that if you lease in, it counts. Why? Because if I have 100 acres of land and I lease it to Alvin, what the concept of leasing is that I may own it, but the control of it is with Alvin. Okay? And I could understand why that would be counted in his inventory. But I have given up the control, except the technical ownership of it. So I shouldn't have to count it, one could make the argument. Now if Alvin, because of crop rotation and other business reasons, he has 100 acres of land, a different 100 acres of land, and he decides to enter into arrangement with Paul McCauley, so that he takes the 100 acres, different 100 acres, and he leases it to Paul McCauley, and Paul has control of it. Okay. Up until 1996, then Alvin was able to deduct that. But since 1995 or 1996, he hasn't been able to.
We've gotten into trouble. Into confusion with this. Not confusion, it's very clear what we have to do. So some growers that like to grow, I'm going to say barley, and that's one of the crops that we use in rotation with our potatoes. So if this person's a cereal producer or a dairy farmer or a hog producer, what have you, and they want acreages of barley, if I lease them my land to grow the barley on, that doesn't come off my acreage, but they're using it. And then sometimes in return they'll say, take my hay ground and plant that in potatoes, which helps us be more sustainable in crop rotation, be better stewards of the land. I have to add that in, so it puts us out of compliance if we're close to our limits on land.
Yeah, but Alvin, and I'm just musing and thinking out loud. But if it was that when you lease in, you have to count it. When you lease out, you don't have to count it. Wouldn't that make a significant adjustment to farmers?
There's common
That's what I'm
sense.
saying to you. I'm agreeing with that.
Yeah, okay, and I just want to make sure that I thought you were, but I just wanted to make sure. I heard someone say common sense.
Horace, why did we change that?
Yeah, so I can't figure.
Well, I wasn't in government at the time. I was just trying to practice law. But it's my understanding that the reason was, just wait a second. JP, Ray asked the reason why the law was changed on the leasing in the mid-90s. I wasn't involved in government at the time, but my recollection is, just as a citizen and a guy that's interested in this type of stuff, that the government was of the opinion that there were some sham leases going on. That what was happening is that Alvin Keenan was saying he was leasing land to Paul McCauley, but he really wasn't. It was still part of the Alvin Keenan Rolla Bay Farms farming operation. But there were ways to deal with that. And one of the ways of dealing with it is just if we say that we're leasing something out, that we're all honorable men and women, we just sign something or declare something when you do your annual returns that you've leased out certain lands, and with that have gone the matter of control. You know? Surely we in our society are prepared to accept as being truthful what honorable men and women say.
Track as it would be a senator. I had to have a little fun here, but that shouldn't be hard to figure out.
It shouldn't be hard to figure out, and the other question shouldn't have been hard for somebody else to figure out either, Alvin.
The only thing there is too is not a lot of farms lease in and don't lease a lot out.
Yeah,
and that's where there are increased acre limits where have to come in. I mean, if you're all
why wouldn't you lease out?
Probably don't have people that was interested in using your fields, and not everybody. In our case, we don't lease much out.
But if you don't own as much land as your farm, then you have to lease in.
Yeah,
it's just simple. You may not own it, but you farm it.
And would, like you said once or twice that what I described was just a common sense thing, so you would support that.
Well, I support it, but there's not everybody, not all farms are going to be leasing out.
Right. And do you have enough land now for what you and your family do?
You never have enough if you want to rotate and look after your lands properly.
Right.
Just on that point that Paul's making, we in PEI, potato-wise, we're doing a terrible job on our seed potatoes. Our virus levels are high. And there's a number of reasons for it, but we got a lot of inoculant. So it's forced us to go off island to buy a higher class seed. And one of the places where we bring seed in from Alberta, they plant potatoes in their land once in 7 years. They've got so much land. And it's part of the reason that we get good seed there, because they're able to rotate well. And of course they're further away from the inoculants of aphids that spread the mosaic virus. But I think what you've said here tonight, Horace, is pretty well, it's quite clear that the tight limits have caused us to be more negligent to land environmental issues, because of the potatoes take a lot out of land, and soybeans don't put a whole lot back in either. They're quite a lot like a potato in terms of, yes, the ground is covered, but you need to get that fiber back up. And that's one of the things they do in the West. They have the rotational crops and the land to do it with.
So you're saying, like when I was growing up on the farm, that there seemed to be a sense of pride that we were disease-free elite seed in Prince Edward Island, and we were the envy because of a whole bunch of reasons, including the fact we were an island. So somewhere along the line, we went from that to now you have to get some elite seed from the province of Alberta.
Well, at one time we only grew 48,000 acres of potatoes in PEI, and then we went up, in 99, I believe, we went to 113,000 or something like that. Yeah. And that was driven by the processing industry, because we had 2 plants and we had more demand for French fries too, than we have now. and that's all. But when we went that high of acreage, we had some varieties that were more susceptible to virus, and Shepherdie was one. It's a variety that doesn't stand up very well, so it'll take potato viruses like mosaic very easily, but it does not affect the yield as great as it would on a russet birdback, let's say. So that variety became the inoculant that made it very difficult for you to grow seed potatoes, because I'm over here growing processing potatoes in the Shepherdie form that have a higher concentration of virus, and over here you're trying to grow an aphid's fly and blow in the wind, and they spread the virus from that field to this one. So that was the big change when we went from 48,000 acres to 100. We just had so many more places for inoculant to feed on, and that's what took the seed industry down. And we've never really, and that goes back to what George was saying too, we can't handle much over 75,000 acres potatoes.
Well, unless someone has something else to say, I think we're going to conclude. I'm going to stay around for quite a while afterwards. You'd like to chat. Just 2 or 3 comments, if I might. I have certain memories of growing up on a farm, and they were that you could work awful hard, and yet a marketplace beyond the community of Hazelbrook seemed to determine how much you get paid for your effort. And I used to think on occasion that maybe there were some missed opportunities in the agricultural community of farmers being able to work together, and it's one of the things that I would certainly hope that we could see increased communication with various farm organizations and so forth. But I think increasingly we're living in a society, and we certainly saw some very diverse opinions, Alf, on the other Thursday night in Charlottetown. And I think that generally speaking, the comments were respectful of each other, but maybe there needs to be additional opportunities for us to listen and speak with each other and to hear, because the more we do, the more we get to know each other. I'm not sure what the forums are going to be, but I'm always of the opinion that, for example, in a church, that the most important business meetings that take place aren't the annual business meetings of a church, but rather the informal dinners and conversations in church members' living rooms that take place during the course of a year before a church business meeting comes together, so we understand and trust each other more. One of the things that it's probably almost the top of my recollection as a youth before I went to Dow on the farm was that going with my dad, we grew a few acres of potatoes, small farming operation, and took some time off in the fall because of school holidays to be able to work on the farm and to get there 4 or 5 acres of potatoes in the ground, and hopefully that could happen quickly, and then we would hopefully lucky enough that we can go off to our cousin's farming operation and make some real cash, because you didn't get paid in the Carver household, but you get paid from the cousins for picking their potatoes. But my dad had a little, I guess an informal arrangement where he used to take his potatoes into a particular restaurant in Charlottetown. Did it for years. And we go in, sell our potatoes, and did it for quite a few years. And it was sort of just a trip to go along with him. And after he'd done that for a number of years, this particular day, he went to take his half truckload of a few bags of potatoes, and did it every week. And he went to the door, and the potatoes stayed in the truck. And I could see my dad talking to the owner of the restaurant. And so I said, "What happened?" And he said, "We're not selling any more potatoes." I said, "What's that?" He says, "Another farmer came along and is prepared to sell his potatoes for 25 cents less per bag." And it's an image that has lasted with me ever since I was a youth. that what was achieved there? Well, the only thing that was achieved is another farmer bought into the marketplace at a reduced level and pushed the price down so that the restaurant owner realizes that he can get cheaper product from a farmer. What's that got to do with what I'm doing? Maybe nothing. I thought I'd just tell it to you. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to have you come out. I know that one or two of you think we should have a bigger crowd, but anyway, so be it. I've thoroughly enjoyed my stay here. Thank those who have taken the time to make some formal presentation. Thank all of those who have participated. And if I have 2 or 3 comments, it would be that this is really the first review in the substantive matter of this act in 30 years. And so one local wit at one of these meetings said to me, I'm asking for a lot of what you were to do here, because this is the only time there's going to be review in the next 30 years, so I'm going to try and get my oar in now. And I suppose you're overly optimistic. Second thing is that keep your expectations reasonable. There'll be no misunderstanding this report. You won't need to hire a lawyer to understand it. It'll be written in very clear language. It'll be easily understood. And whether you end up agreeing with it or disagreeing with it, the only thing I can assure you it will have received a lot of thought, all independent thought. And I just wish you all the very best. You're terrific citizens of this province, and it's a pleasure to meet some of you tonight for the first time. Thank you for coming.